The sergeant had been in the Marine Corps for 11 years, and he had never once said the thing he was about to say to a commanding officer, and he said it now because he believed it was true and because somebody had to. He found the colonel near the middle of the stalled column, in the dark, in the cold that had stopped being a number and become simply the condition of the world, and he told him that the men were finished. He did not mean it as an excuse. He was not a man who made excuses, which was part of why it landed the way it did. He meant it as a report, the way he would have reported ammunition running low or a bridge gone out. He had walked the column, he had looked at the men, and in his professional judgment, the judgment of a good NCO, who knew his Marines the way a good NCO does, they had reached the end of what a human being could do. They had been fighting and marching and freezing for days without real sleep, and they were out, not cowardly, not broken in spirit, just used up, all the way to the bottom, the way a man is used up when the body has spent everything it has and there is nothing left in the account to draw on. And Colonel Louis Puller listened to him, and did not argue, and did not tell him he was wrong. What Puller did instead, without saying almost anything at all, is the reason that Sergeant followed him for the rest of the war, and told the story for the rest of his life. If you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Let me back up, because to understand why the sergeant said what he said, and why it took courage to say it, you have to understand what those men had already been through by the time he said it. In late November and early December of 1950, the 1st Marine Division was fighting its way out of the Chosin Reservoir in the mountains of northern Korea, surrounded by a Chinese force many times its size, on a single road, in cold that fell to 30 and 35 degrees below zero, with a wind off the high ground that took whatever a man had left. And the thing about that kind of ordeal that is hard to convey to anyone who has not been in something like it is that it does not stay physical. It starts physical. The cold, the wounds, the hunger, the marching. But past a certain point, it becomes something else. The body spends its reserves, and then it spends the reserves it did not know it had, and then it reaches a place where every remaining step is drawn not from the muscles, which are empty, but from somewhere further in, somewhere that does not have a name in ordinary life, because ordinary life never asks you to go there. The men of that division had been in that place for days. They had been cold past the point where cold is felt as pain. They had been tired past the point where tiredness is felt as sleepiness, and had entered the country beyond it, where a man can stand up and walk and fire a rifle and be, in some real sense, no longer fully there. They had watched friends die. They had carried the wounded and the dead, and they had kept moving, because moving was the only thing that was not death, down a road that did not seem to end, toward a sea they had to take partly on faith because none of them had seen it. By any reasonable measure, the sergeant was right. They were finished. There was a strong argument that what he was reporting was simply a fact. Now, here's the thing. When a good sergeant tells you the men are finished, you are hearing something very specific, and a wise commander knows exactly how much weight it carries. Because a good NCO does not cry wolf. A good NCO spends his whole career being the man who says the platoon can do it, sir. The man who finds the last 10% in his Marines when the officers have given up on it. The man whose entire professional identity is built on the men being able to do more than they think they can. When a man like that comes to you and says they are finished, he is not making the easy statement. He is making the hardest statement of his career. He is spending his own credibility, the thing he has built over 11 years, to tell you a truth he wishes were not true. So Puller could not simply dismiss it. To wave off that particular sergeant with that particular report would have been to ignore the most reliable instrument he had for reading his own men. The sergeant was, in effect, a gauge that had never given a false reading, and the gauge was now reading empty. And yet, here's what the sergeant himself understood, in retrospect, decades later, and what he said made the whole thing unforgettable. He was right that the men were finished, and he was wrong about what that meant, because finished is a word from ordinary life, and it describes a real thing, the end of the body's reserves, the bottom of the account. But the men of that division were not living an ordinary life. They were in a place where the ordinary rules about what a finished man can do had stopped applying, and where the question was no longer how much is left in the account, because the answer to that was nothing, but rather what a man can still do when the account is empty and he keeps going anyway. And that question does not have a physical answer. It has a different kind of answer, and Puller knew, in a way the sergeant in that moment did not, that the answer to it is not found in the men. It is found in what the men can see. Stay with me, because what Puller did next is the whole thing, and he did it almost without words. He did not give a speech to the column. There was a version of this where the famous colonel climbs onto something and rallies the exhausted men with a few unforgettable lines, and it is a good scene, and it is not what he did, because he understood that men in the state those men were in cannot be reached by words. Words were too far away. Words required a kind of attention they no longer had. He did not argue with the sergeant. He did not tell him he was wrong, because he was not wrong, not about what he had measured. What he did was hand his own reserve of whatever it was to men who had run out of theirs, and he did it the only way it can actually be transferred, which is not by telling but by showing. He walked to the front of the column, alone, on foot, a 52-year-old man who had been in the same cold and the same fight and the same days without sleep as everyone else, and who was carrying, though almost none of them knew the details, the same exhaustion in an older body. He walked up the length of that stalled, freezing, finished column, past the men sitting in the snow, past the men who could not feel their feet, past the men who had reached the bottom of the account, and he put himself at the front of it, in the dark, facing the direction they had to go. And he started walking that way. And this is where it gets complicated, because on the surface he had done nothing. He had issued no order the men could hear. He had solved no physical problem. The cold was the same. The distance was the same. The account was still empty. By every measure the sergeant had used, nothing had changed. Except that the men, one by one, down the length of that column, saw their regimental commander walk to the front and turn toward the enemy and the distance and start moving, alone, on foot, at 52, in the same cold that had finished them. And they got up. Not because they had found reserves they did not have. The sergeant was right. The reserves were gone. They got up because a finished man will still, it turns out, follow another man who is walking. If the man walking is one of them, if he is paying the same price, if he is not shouting at them from a warm place, but is out there in front, in the same cold, going the same direction, asking nothing he was not already doing himself. That is the thing that has no name in ordinary life. That is what Puller transferred, up the length of that column, without a speech, without an argument, without telling the sergeant he was wrong. He did not put reserves back in the men. He gave them something to follow into the place beyond reserves, and he gave it to them the only way it can be given, which is by going there first, himself, where they could see him. See, what most people miss about this story is that they think it is about inspiration, about a leader lifting his men with the force of his example. It is about something more precise than that. It is about the difference between the two kinds of leadership that look identical on paper and are opposite in the cold. There is the leadership that tells men to go, and there is the leadership that goes and is followed. On a good day, in a warm room, with rested men, they produce the same result and you cannot tell them apart. But at the bottom of the account, on the worst night, when the men are finished and the words cannot reach them, only one of them works. The colonel who tells the finished men to get up gets nothing, because there is nothing left in them to command. The colonel who walks to the front and goes gets a column on its feet, because he has bypassed the empty account entirely and reached the thing underneath it, the thing that answers not to orders but to example, not to what a man is told, but to what he sees another man do. The sergeant was not wrong about the men. He was measuring the account. Puller was not arguing with the measurement. He was reaching past it to the only place that still had anything in it, and he could reach it because he was willing to go there first. That is not inspiration. Inspiration is a word for the warm room. This was a 52-year-old man spending his own body in front of finished men to show them where the last of it was. The sergeant, who had told his colonel the truth at the hardest moment of his career, watched Puller walk to the front of the column, and watched the men get up, and understood something in that moment that he spent the rest of his life trying to put into words and never quite could. He had reported that the men were finished, and he had been right, and he had watched them get up anyway and follow a man who was as finished as they were, because that man had gone first. And what he understood, standing there in the cold, was that there are two different things the word finished can mean, and that the whole art of command, the thing his colonel had that he was only beginning to grasp, was knowing the difference, knowing when finished means stop, and when finished means the men have reached the exact place where they can no longer be told and can still be shown. The column moved. The men who were finished walked the rest of the way out of Chosin behind a colonel who was just as finished as they were, and who had decided that this was not a fact to be reported, but a place to be led through, from the front, on foot, where they could see him. He did not talk about it as anything remarkable, later. Most of them did not, but the sergeant did. The sergeant talked about the night he told Chesty Puller the men were finished, and Puller did not argue, and did not make a speech, and simply walked to the front and started going the way they had to go, until the finished men got up and went with him. So, was the sergeant wrong to say it? Some would say yes, that a Marine does not tell his commander the men are finished, that the word itself is a kind of surrender, and that the sergeant's job was to find the last of it in his men, not to come to his colonel and report empty. Others would say the sergeant did exactly right, and that his courage in saying the hardest true thing of his career is half of what made the moment work. That a commander who never hears the truth from his NCOs is a commander flying blind, and that Puller's answer was not a rebuke of the report, but a response to it. You are right, they are finished, and here is the only thing that moves finished men, and I will do it myself. That the sergeant and the colonel together, the honest report and the wordless answer, are what got the column up. Let us know where you land in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, make sure you subscribe.